you drive into the heart of me. The love we share seems to go nowhere, and I've lost my light. For I just and turn, I can sleep at night. Once I ran to you, now I run from you. This tainted love you've given, I give you all a boy could give you. Take my tears and that's not nearly all. Tainted love, tainted love. Now I know I've got you. Run away, I've got to get away. You don't really want any more from me. To make things right, you need someone to hold you tight. And you think love is to pray, but I'm sorry, I don't pray that way. Once I ran to you, now I run from you. This tainted love you've given, I give you all a boy could give you. Take my tears and that's not nearly all. Tainted love, tainted love.
Come with me, my love, to the sea of love, 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 love. I want to tell you how much
1, 2. Testing. I might actually turn.
I never know what to say to test a microphone. Nope. I can be heard in a room this size without a microphone, believe me. Yeah. It's on. It's on. But no, no.
Testing 1 2.
Testing, testing. How's this now? I think you can hear me. Yeah.
Why don't we all take our seats and we'll start our lecture. I know we have a lot of good friends, old friends, new friends here, and people interested in building technology. Couldn't be a better group. Andrew, go ahead.
Kristen. That chair's mine that's turned sideways. And my guest, sorry. All right, looks like we've got everybody pretty well situated. Can everyone hear me? Good, I won't bore you for more than probably a minute or two. Welcome to the Cliff Dwellers. I'm Andrew Elders. I am on the board of directors here. I've been a member for 5 years, actually, and really happy to be a part of this. I helped Ann get this scheduled for us. She had come to me and said we need to have a place to host a really terrific book signing and talk about the origin of the skyscraper, and I said that fits exactly with who we are and what we do. So I am pleased that you are all here. I don't know if it's your first time or if you've been here many times, but you're all very, very welcome. You are also very, very welcome to speak to a member if you'd like to join or learn more about joining. We do have a 3-month trial membership period at $50 a month, so it's a heck of a good deal. And we have reduced rates for those under 40, and those are excellent deals as well. So talk to me, talk to any of these gentlemen in the front row here. They are sort of our grand old guard here up at the front. They're taking notes and grading us, I think. But the Cliff Dwellers has a long and celebrated history in Chicago's art and architecture community. Our reason for existing is to connect the business community and the artistic community to make connections to foster the arts and growth of culture here in Chicago. We've been around since 1907. For the first 90 years of our existence, we had a clubhouse on top of Orchestra Hall next door. And we moved up here in 1996, and we can't be happier with our space. It's a beautiful sort of penthouse in the sky, and in the summertime, it's especially glorious. So with that, like I said, any members would be happy to answer your questions. Come seek me out. You could probably hear me from just about anybody in the room. So with that, I will hand it over to Rachel Will, who is with the Association for Preservation Technology.
Thanks, Anders.
Welcome.
Well, good evening and welcome. Thank you all for showing up today. As Anders mentioned, this is a program that was established through the Association for Preservation Technology. It's actually through the international organization, and we are the local chapter associated with that organization. Ann Sullivan is one of our fellows of the association, and she organized this for our speaker tonight, John Friedman, who is also one of the fellows of our organization. So I'm going to just take a few minutes to talk a little bit about the Western Great Lakes chapter, some of the events we do. If you like things like this and you'd like to become a member, I'll undersell Anders for a minute and say our membership is only $30 a year. So, but please pay attention. Now you're on our mailing list, so you will get notifications of our events. So we are the chapter that supports the Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. We were originally part of another chapter. This chapter's been around about 15 years, I think, is pretty close, maybe around that time. But we're one of the local chapters. And as with many of the local chapters, as part of this international organization, a lot of the local type events, things like these lectures, field trips, other types of events are typically happening at the local level. And typically we have an annual symposium, so we're hopeful to reinstitute that again this year. So as what are the benefits? Here's some of the things that we typically offer as part of the chapter. So on the left side, we have the chapter benefits, and unfortunately as part of this organization, being an international member doesn't automatically qualify you for the chapter, but it is just that $30 a year. So please consider joining. You don't have to be a member of the international organization to be a local member of the chapter. So as I said, it's $30 for individuals. It's $50 for corporate memberships, which offers up to 2 participants for each of those organizations. And then we oftentimes have sponsors. So $250 is the sponsor level for 3 participants, $500 for 4, $750 for 4 as well, and then $1,000. And those are, there's other things associated with sponsorship that would be notified as part of our events. So we'll include certain things associated with that. So a couple of things that are upcoming this year for 2022. If you like to venture north up to Wisconsin to the University of Milwaukee, or University of Wisconsin Stout campus in Wisconsin, there's going to be a tour of some of their historic buildings. Most recently, hopefully many of you saw the announcement that came out today for the tour of the Music Row, which is down in the southern portion of Chicago. I think that's actually on May 19th, I think. So please sign up for that. It's hosted by members of Bauer Latoza. One of the things that we've done in the past and has had great success is our haunted architecture tour. So please look out for announcements about that. And then some of our members up in our Minneapolis area typically do bulletin clubs. So the bulletin is the journal that's associated with our international organization, and they get together like a book club and talk about some of the articles. Some of the things that we did this year already were a stained glass workshop at Regali Studios, which was really great. That happened in March. And we did an event with our School of the Art Institute students as a mentoring event, so a condition assessment. And I see many of them out here tonight, so great. Thanks, guys, for showing up. So our sponsors are Bean Engineering, Altus Works, Berglund Construction, and WJE. And I think that might be it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Brush, who is a preservation architect here in Chicago, who is going to introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mary Brush of Brush Architects. My connection to APT is I was one of the founding teams of the Western Great Lakes chapter. I was vice president and then became president of AI Illinois and couldn't do them both. But more importantly for today, Don Friedman I've known for the vast majority of my professional career. He is why I climb and rappel down the outside of Skyscrapers, because I met him at a conference, a preservation conference, and the conversation started about blues, and I took him and some friends to a blues club, and we talked apparently enough about technology that he said, you're not really doing preservation, you're designing additions to historic buildings, and you seem to do technology, so I thought that was cocktail party conversation. And about 2 weeks later, he called me and said, my Chicago office is hiring you. You should give notice. So he knows a vast amount of the evolution of the skyscraper. He has spent all of his free time studying not just the standard history of who built what when, but how and why, and how the codes have changed, and how the analysis of structural loading diagrams has changed, and the materials changed. And then he's written these brilliant books that are not as dry as dirt, the way that some structural books can be. They're entertaining, they're filled with history and stories, and he's very talented. So he's the show. So there you go.
There we go. Mary asked me what I wanted her to say, and I said, whatever you think is appropriate, and there we go. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to APT Great Lakes for giving me this opportunity to be here. This is a topic that I've talked about a lot in various ways. As I said to a couple of people tonight, I'm much more nervous being here tonight than I have been at any other talk in a long time. So I'm going to Well, a lot of my talk focuses on the difference between historical fact and opinion, which is, I think, we all know what those two things are. I'm going to start with a statement of opinion that you are free to disagree with, but I hope you'll grant me a few minutes on it. And that statement is this: I am not a complete idiot. I did not travel 800 miles to face a room full of people who know the history of Chicago skyscrapers, know it very well, may very well know it better than I do, and tell you that you're wrong about everything you think. It would be a waste of your time, it would be a waste of my time, it would be, frankly, idiotic. So that's not what tonight is, good news. What I want to do in this talk is give a bit of perspective on that difference between fact and opinion. And what it all sort of comes down to is that a lot of skyscraper history has been written from one viewpoint, and that is architectural history. Perfectly understandable. When I was first interested in this topic, that's what I looked up, was architectural history. But I think that using that perspective to the exclusion of other perspectives has perhaps limited where we can go with this history. One last note before I get going. I've used almost entirely New York buildings. I tried to use buildings that you're probably not familiar with. I thought that would be nice, show you a different building. The Irving Trust Tower is not the first skyscraper. It would be incredibly cool if it had been, that if nobody built skyscrapers and then in 1929 somebody built a 40-story, very slender tower. It's not. I just like the picture and I have some history with that building. So my research included a lot of topics related to the main topic of skyscraper history, including why people started building these buildings, which is not the focus of my talk tonight, and how to deal with deterioration in them today, which is something that is of interest to APT and is certainly in the book, and it's what I do for a living, but it's not really tonight's topic. What I want to focus on tonight is a question that people have been kicking around since the 1890s, which is, what is the first skyscraper? And since it's the 1890s and Irving Trust is 1929, that gives you one of the answers right there. To use a phrase that you see a lot these days, I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. My answer to what is the first skyscraper is neither the building that a lot of you probably think it is, nor is it in New York. So, yeah, you see? So this argument actually began in the 1890s when Bradford Gilbert, who had the architect who designed the Tower building in New York in 1889, a bunch of his friends paid to have a plaque put up on the building saying it was the first skyscraper. And as you might guess, that caused some uproar in Chicago. So that's when this debate begins, the late 1890s. It really got going again in the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians in the 1950s. There was a series of articles on the topic, what's the first skyscraper? What criteria do we use? But again, the criteria that were being discussed in those articles, and those articles are great articles, those criteria are architectural history. And what I want to do is something other than that and get away from that. It's probably worth mentioning. I work a lot in historic preservation, but I have no training in that field. I learned that on the job, for better and worse. I do actually have formal training as a historian, not perhaps as much as I would like, but some. And in the process, one of the first things you learn when you're looking at history is how do you decide what is a fact? And I'd like to point out, we have, I don't know, 100 people in the room here tonight. There is an infinite number of absolutely true facts that could be said about this room at this time, as I'm giving my talk. What color shirt is everyone in the room wearing? Where is everyone sitting? Where did you all come from before you came here? You could write thousands of pages full of verifiable fact about this audience, and it would all be useless, meaningless stuff because nobody cares what color shirt you're wearing as a historical fact. It matters to you, it matters to me, we all want to look good, but it's not something that we really care about as historical fact. So just because something is a fact doesn't mean it make it useful. Just because something is opinion doesn't make it fact, right? So in architectural history, you're looking at buildings as a matter of formal design the intent of the architects, the intent of the engineers perhaps, outside influences such as building codes and other legal constraints. In the field that I've spent more time working in, which is the history of technology, individual buildings are not necessarily very important. And the reason is that I'm looking at the underlying structural technologies that make skyscrapers possible. And the technologies, plural. And if you do that, if you look at those technologies, it is almost impossible to find a single building that represents an abrupt break with the past. Maybe it's possible, maybe it's not. Because there are so many gray areas when you're discussing technology, you have to distinguish between errors and disagreement. It's very easy to find factual errors in papers and books and so on. I've seen people refer to buildings that have cast iron columns as having steel skeleton frames in well-received histories. That's flat out wrong. Doesn't invalidate the whole book, but that statement is wrong. And it's wrong specifically, I mean, a metal column is a metal column, right? It's wrong specifically because of structural action. Cast iron columns cannot take any load but compression. They therefore cannot serve in the moment frame, and they're not very good elements to use even in the braced frame. So if you're looking at the structural technology, the difference between cast iron columns and wrought iron or steel columns matters as an understanding of what that technology is. There are gray areas where you can disagree without anybody being wrong. Do you count the height of a building, this is an old one, right, to the main roof, to the top of an ornamental roof, to the highest piece of attached structure? I mean, anybody who thinks the push pin on top of the new One World Trade Center is the top of the building is kidding themselves. It's the highest occupied floor that is of real interest, but that's my opinion. That is not a fact. There is no fact. You can make the top of the building whatever you want it to be. When I first started thinking about this topic of fact versus opinion, the first example that leapt into my head, I'm a Mets fan. I disagree with Cubs fans. I think Yankees fans are wrong. So this is where we have to start. And this is a surprisingly difficult piece of Jell-O to nail to the wall. What criteria are you going to use? How do you decide which criteria are usable and which are not? How do you know what you know about the buildings? And the fact is, before you can even define a skyscraper, you have to define what a building is, which is surprisingly difficult. One opinion that you will hear is that a building has to have a skeleton frame to be a skyscraper. And skeleton frame actually has a definition. That's a usable one. Skeleton frame is when the structural load of the exterior walls is carried on the building frame. Now, building frame, we have to use the modern sort of inclusive definition that includes a building with concrete shear walls as its vertical element, because if you talk to somebody from 1890, they're going to say that those concrete shear walls look a lot like bearing walls to them. We today accept that concrete shear walls are part of a frame. So I'm going to go with that. I'm going to try and stick with the popular stuff, but that's a matter of opinion. If you say you have to have skeleton framing for a skyscraper, the Monadnock building is not a skyscraper. If you say that, the Rookery is not a skyscraper. And to be fair, I threw in a New York building, the World Building, which is the tallest building in the world by certain opinions, from 1890 to 1892, is not a skyscraper. Now, I personally think that the definition of skyscraper that excludes iconic buildings like these is not a good one. But there's no way to separate that opinion from fact. It is an opinion of mine that that's true. If someone says a skyscraper has to have a skeleton frame, I can't say that they're wrong. I can point to the building in the lower, well, the quote, building, unquote, in the lower right-hand corner. That is the Colwell Shot Tower in New York. And for those of you who don't know what a shot tower is, how do you make shot as in a shotgun? And the answer in the 19th century was you dumped molten lead at the top of this very tall structure and let it fall. And as it fell through the air, it would spin around, and it would be nice little spheres of lead down at the bottom. That's what a shot tower is. In other words, this is sort of a reverse chimney. 120 feet tall, a metal frame supporting masonry walls. You can actually see, if you look closely, you can see the frame in that photograph. How is that not a skeleton frame? Now, it doesn't have floors. It's not a very usable building. But this was solely, the criterion was it has to be a skeleton frame. By that standard, the Colwell Shot Tower is the first skeleton frame in New York City in the mid-19th century. And there were earlier examples in Europe. I will therefore state my opinion that this criterion by itself is not very useful. It doesn't get us very far in the conversation of what's the first skyscraper. As you can see, I was having fun with Google finding images. If it's just height, and actually this is the standard that Wikipedia uses, interestingly enough. If it's just height, then the tallest building in the world for 4,000 years was the Great Pyramid of Giza. I don't find that to be very useful in discussing skyscrapers. And this actually gets us into the issue of what is a building and what is not. I mean, how do you even start with this? I would argue, my opinion, is that a building has to have interior space, usable, occupied by people, their possessions, their animals, whatever. Something that people have and use in their society has to be contained within the building. And it has to be a substantial percentage of the building. There are some spaces within the Great Pyramid, but they're very small. And my opinion is we don't count the dead people inside as occupants. There's no fact here. This is all opinion. So the Great Pyramid was the tallest building in the world until the year 1311, when at 481 feet as it was built, it was surpassed by Lincoln Cathedral in England. After Lincoln Cathedral, it's a series of cathedrals and churches until, on the right, we have Ulm Minster in Germany, 530 feet tall, those towers. Those are not negligible structures. Keep in mind, at the time that was built, the Eiffel Tower had already been built. Ulm Minster was built in 1890. The Eiffel Tower already existed. So if you're going to say, as Wikipedia does, that Ulm Minster was the tallest building in the world, you are making a distinction that it is a building and the Eiffel Tower is not. And that comes back to what I was already talking about, right? Why is the Eiffel Tower not a building? During the very, very brief period where I was editing Wikipedia on a volunteer basis, I got into a really fascinating discussion with an architect from Romania. And her position was, if people built a structure, it was a building. And she was arguing that the CN Tower was the tallest building in North America for quite some time. And I said, no, there's a distinction between a building and a tower. And she said, what is it? And I said, I don't know. This comes back to what I said before. You have to have occupiable space. And I'm going to give you I'm going to use modern definition of how to measure that. Floor area ratio. Now, floor area ratio in practice, those of us in the room who've dealt with it in practice, is typically taken on the usable floor area of a building divided by the size of the lot. That is not very useful for this conversation, because what if you have a building sitting on a big piece of empty land? So what I want to do is just tweak that definition a little bit and say floor area ratio, where you divide the usable floor area of a building by the footprint at the base of the building. So if a building goes straight up for 12 stories, it's got an FAR of 12. If you do that, if you think about it that way, and Chicago actually has more buildings more old skyscrapers that go straight up than New York does. Our buildings tend to have more setbacks in the old days. You're looking at, you want to have an FAR maybe in the double digits before you call it a building, before you call it a skyscraper. And then certainly an FAR of more than 0, which is what the Colwell Shot Tower had. The Eiffel Tower's FAR is something like a half, because there are usable floors, but they don't occupy that much space. And it's, a 300-meter tall tower with an FAR of a half. So it doesn't really sound like a building. Almminster only held the title for 4 years. In 1894, the first non-pyramid, non-church takes the title, and that is Philadelphia City Hall, the tower there. Now, and this is perhaps getting ahead of myself, I don't count the Philadelphia City Hall tower. And the reason is sort of an extension of, and this is all opinion, it's an extension of the FAR argument. I want the upper floors of a building to have some reasonable percentage of the usable floor area. If you look at height and slenderness, and this is Trinity Church in New York, and as you can see, it is quite a bit shorter than the late 19th and early 20th century skyscrapers that surround it. This particular photograph is around 1900, and it was already shorter. That spire is 280 feet. It is not a small structure. However, Trinity Church is effectively a one-story building. I mean, there's a small balcony. It's pretty much a one-story building. And I've been up in that spire, and it is, I would argue it's not really occupiable. The ladders are ones that I could manage with some difficulty, and it got to the point where I was sending smaller people from the office. So yeah, but in any case, that is a very tall, very slender structure right there. You know, and the tallest building in New York until I think 1890, when the World Building was built, but not a skyscraper. So obviously I'm playing around here with definitions, but I'm trying to make sense of these two things. The World Building in New York, the one that I previously showed you with a nice slash through it, was the tallest building in New York, tallest building by the FAR definition in the world, until 1892, when, of course, the Masonic Temple was built here in Chicago. I'm also reluctant to use slenderness as a criterion because, frankly, it's skewed to New York, and I'm trying very hard to be fair. Chicago early skyscrapers tend to be not very slender. A lot of them are sort of cubes. And from the New York standard, they don't really look like skyscrapers, but they are. So, by my opinion, and by most people's opinions, they are. So I'm very reluctant to use slenderness for that reason. You can find all sorts of people saying that metal framing and particularly cast iron facades are a precursor to skyscrapers. This is a close-up of the Howard Building in New York, arguably the architecturally nicest cast iron facade in the city. We have a lot of cast iron still in existence. This is just an amazing building. Fortunately, it had been painted almost black for years, and it's been finally repainted in its historic color, which is an off-white, and it looks much nicer. Everything you're seeing in this photograph, except for the fire escape, is cast iron. Just to make it clear for those of you who are not familiar with cast iron architecture. The main cornice at the top of the building is sheet wrought iron on a wood frame, but the intermediate water tables are cast iron. So why isn't this a step towards being a skyscraper? Why isn't this a structural innovation that really matters? And the short version is, this is a bearing wall. This is a replacement for a masonry bearing wall, and it specifically is a replacement that it was used because it was cheaper and faster to build and gave you bigger windows, which if you were building industrial space in a flammable neighborhood, and that's what almost all of the cast iron buildings in New York are, if you were building that, you could get bigger windows and therefore be less reliant on gas lights and lamps and candles. People in Chicago may very well not know this. One of the old nicknames, the neighborhood that we now call Soho, which is where New York's biggest concentration of cast iron is, was for a very long time officially the Lower West Side. Its nickname, when my father worked there in a warehouse carrying bolts of cloth around, he was a big, strong guy, and it was a good job while he was putting himself through school. Its nickname was Hell's 100 Acres, because when those buildings caught fire, there was no way to put them out. They were flammable buildings full of cloth. They were a nightmare for the New York Fire Department. So these buildings are no different than the masonry wall buildings next door in some cases, or right around the corner, They just have a cast iron bearing wall rather than a masonry bearing wall. That doesn't seem to me, my opinion, doesn't seem to me to be a very big difference in technology. It's an interesting step, and cast iron plays a role in skyscrapers a little later on. The Howell building is from around 1860. Most of these buildings in New York are late 1850s, 1860s. The use of exposed iron like this was outlawed in New York in 1882. So it was a relatively short period where this was going on. And it was not, it overlaps with the beginning of skyscraper development, but there's really no connection. If you look at the people who were building these buildings and the people who were building the early skyscrapers in New York, there's really no connection. And Chicago, the other birthplace of skyscrapers, doesn't have this cast iron facade tradition the same way. Yes, there were cast iron buildings here, but relatively many fewer. There's the Eiffel Tower, finally. So what are my criteria? Sooner or later, I was not going to be able to escape this question, right? What are my criteria for a skyscraper? And I needed to do this before I could start research, right? If you're going to look up a bunch of buildings and say, these are the buildings that are skyscrapers that are worthy of research, you have to make this decision before you start the research. Otherwise, you find yourself going back and forth quite a bit. And I decided on basically two criteria. Number one, it has to be a usable building in the sense that I've already described. It has to have a reasonable FAR. And it varies, of course. There are buildings that had very high floor-to-floor height, and therefore, for their height, they had relatively little floor space. And a good example of that is the Fair Store here in Chicago, where the floors are almost twice a normal floor-to-floor height, and therefore you would expect more floor area for a building that size. But it didn't have it, it had 8 stories. So a usable building the way I've described a building. I should point out there are no objective criteria here, and everything you say you will find an exception to as you go into the historical record. My second criteria was that it should be tall for its time. It is very easy to find, again, if you go looking at discussion today, people who say that a skyscraper has to be 100 meters tall. Well, if you say that, what's the first skyscraper in the US? Probably the Park Row building in New York, which is 1899, which is awfully late. So 100 meters might make sense for today, for 2022, but it doesn't make sense when you go back and look at the historic buildings. And I found that if you're using FAR, the overall height of the building can vary a great deal. Some of the industrial buildings have low floor-to-floor heights. Some of the residential buildings have very high floor-to-floor heights. So I said, rather than counting feet or meters, why not count floors? And I settled on 10 floors. First of all, it's a round number, and everybody knows how engineers love round numbers. But secondly, it's taller than people were building buildings before they started building skyscrapers. People were not building usable 10-story buildings. They were building buildings perhaps the height of 10 stories, such as Trinity Church, but they weren't in the US building 10-story buildings prior to the beginning of skyscrapers. So that seemed like a good thing. The other thing about 10 stories is that it is tall enough that nobody would build that expecting to get much rent off the 10th story in the pre-skyscraper era. You know, if you think about phrases that we use that give us little hints about the way people used to think about tall buildings, why did artists live in garrets? The answer was that the top story was cheap because you had to go up all those stairs, right? So the top floor, people didn't used to think about a view like this. They thought about, how am I going to get up there with my groceries? I said earlier, before I move on, I said earlier that there are always gray areas. Let me point out that the home insurance building, as built, was 9 stories plus a basement. It was not 10 stories tall. That was exactly my reaction. I thought it was 11 stories, and then I found out it was built as 9. And the thing is that in general, and I'll come back to what that means in a second, I in general use the height of the building was built at, not one that it was raised to. And again, that is sort of me trying to be fair to places other than New York, because Every single building in New York that I looked at had a floor or two added to it. It was less common elsewhere. And I finally said, you know, if a building is iconic and 9.5 stories, or like the Fair Store, 8 stories, I'm going to include it because it's already part of the conversation. It seems churlish to exclude it on the basis of a subjective criteria that I myself created. So I also did not count the Reliance building as a 2-story building, even though. So when I say I generally use the height that buildings were first built at, there's an exception to that. You name a rule I was using, and I found exceptions to it. There's also the question, of course, of how many stories a building is. If it's on a sloped site, and on one side it's 20 stories, and on the other side it's 21 stories, what do you put it down as? And the answer is, there is no answer. It is a matter of opinion. I have, over the last 15 minutes perhaps, laid out a trap for you. And I'm going to guess at least some of you have fallen into this trap. There are many possible sets of criteria. I could stand here for several hours going through all the criteria I looked at and rejected, and all the criteria that I've seen other people use for what is a skyscraper. I've only mentioned a few of them, right? If your response to my presentation so far is, but if you use these criteria, you get this result. You get the home insurance building, or you get some other building. If that's your response, then you're acknowledging that it's all subjective, because you're selecting the criteria that gets you the results you want. That's the trap. So I'm glad we can all agree that it's subjective. I had mentioned this building during the pre-talk drinking. This is the Manus building in New York. This is not one end of the Manus building. This is the entire building. The thing with the big cornice, that is the Manus building. It was 16 feet wide and 54 feet long and 10 stories tall. This building was ridiculous. It should never have been built. There was a skyscraper boom, in the cultural sense going on in New York in the 1890s. This is 1893. And every single person who owned a single lot in Lower Manhattan thought they were going to become rich by building a skyscraper. And Mr. Manus built this. Interestingly enough, after he found out that this was not going to make him rich, it was rather going to make him poor because of the relative cost of maintenance versus the amount of rent he could get. Keep in mind that tiny building, 1 bay wide, 4 bays long, there's an elevator and a stair in there. Right? There is amazingly little floor space in this building. He built a second Manus building, which I lived in for several years, so everything's all connected. This is an example of one of the differences between New York and Chicago. We have smaller blocks, and our blocks, particularly downtown, tend to have fragmented ownership. And as a result, there was always a very long, drawn-out process of assembling lots, of convincing people to sell their property before you could build a skyscraper in the 1890s or the 1880s or the 1900s. And there were always people who refused to sell. And this continued well into the 20th century. If you look at Macy's, which occupies a full block, 34th to 35th Street, 6th Avenue to 7th Avenue, and that's a large block. It's 200 by 500 feet. One corner of it is sort of nipped out of the building because the people who owned the corner lot hated Macy's and refused to sell, even though they were offered an enormous amount of money. And for years, they just, out of spite, did nothing. And then, I don't know if it was a change of generation and the children were less spiteful than the parents or whatever happened. The same family still owns the building. But they said to Macy's, hey, would you like to cover up the upper floors of our building with your billboards? And that's how it is today. So my criteria for categorization, having said that everything 10 stories and taller that is an occupiable building is a skyscraper, right? That is my position here. I want to talk about structure. I'm a structural engineer. So I finally decided I was going to break down the possible ways of looking at the structure into 3 loads. The gravity load of the interior floors and roof, that's number one. The gravity load of the walls, and I usually mean the exterior walls, but there are buildings where it turns out to mean the interior walls as well, and the lateral wind load on the building. And when you say lateral load, obviously you could include seismic, except that in the 19th century, nobody was designing buildings for seismic loads, and therefore there would be no skyscrapers until 1927 if you said skyscrapers. Had to have seismic design. So those three loads lead you to three main categories of structure in old skyscrapers, and two of those categories have two subcategories, if that's not confusing enough. See another building you don't know. It's actually 8 buildings you don't know. This is the Central Park Apartments, otherwise known as the Spanish Flats. You can see the division between the different buildings. It's those very dark arches. Those are like, well, they refer to them in the plan to convince people to rent these apartments as courtyards. I would call them air shafts. This building had a great location facing Central Park. That's Central Park on the left where the trees are in the foreground. But the apartments had a lot of the failings of 19th century apartments, not enough plumbing, windows that face air shafts, things like that. So it was functionally obsolete and torn down for that reason long before it was physically in danger. It was built in 1883, and it meets my criteria. I counted this as one skyscraper because I wasn't trying to run up the score for New York. Arguably, it's 8 skyscrapers, but we're going to call this one building. There's the floor plan of an apartment. It's very nice to have 9 bedrooms. It would be nice to have more than one shower and toilet for those 9 bedrooms. But the important thing here are those very dark lines, which are masonry bearing walls, which meet the prescriptive provisions of the 1882 New York City Building Code, which required very thick walls. So this is what I'm calling, for the sake of argument, a pure bearing wall building. All of the interior floor load and the roofs is carried on bearing walls. There's no vertical structure other than bearing walls. Another building you don't know. This is also a bearing wall building. This is the Healy building from 1891 in Lower Manhattan. This is a bearing wall building, and I like this picture because people, and I include myself in that, you hear the phrase bearing wall building and you think dark, really heavy walls. Look at this, look at all that window area. That is fantastic for a bearing wall building, particularly since the New York Building Code required if you were missing a piece of wall because there was window there, the adjacent masonry had to get thicker to compensate. In other words, the cross-sectional area of wall had to stay the same no matter how big your windows were. So the piers that are not at those big windows must have been rather thick. This is what I'm calling a mixed bearing wall building because the exterior is bearing walls and the interior had cast iron columns. So the interior structure is partly supported on bearing walls and partly supported on columns. All of the lateral wind load is taken by the walls. So that's a bearing wall building is one where the wall load and the floor load are carried on the walls and the wind load is taken by the walls. All 3 loads are going into the masonry. And this is, of course, the traditional way of building a building that goes back to prehistory, right? There's no surprise in this building type. This is where things get funny. So this is the Merchants Bank building in Brooklyn. I'm going to keep bragging about how incredibly fair I was in trying to not run up the score for New York. Brooklyn was a separate city until 1898. I counted Brooklyn separately from New York, even though my research ends in 1900, because I said, we don't need to add those buildings to New York's total. This is the Merchants Bank in downtown Brooklyn, still there. And it's obviously got a metal frame, right? That's what this picture is showing. But there's something very peculiar about that metal frame, and the close-up on the right, I think, makes it a little more clear. Look at where the perimeter columns are, and look at where the spandrel beam is. That spandrel beam is entirely inboard of the column, and the columns are not right at the exterior of the wall. They're set well into the wall. So those floor beams cannot possibly be supporting the wall. They're just not in the right position to do so. The definition of a cage frame building is that the interior floor load is carried on the frame, on the columns, not on the walls. But the exterior wall load is carried on by itself. The exterior wall is self-supporting, surrounding a metal frame building. Now, there are two subtypes to cage frame buildings. And this is what I'm going to call a wall-braced cage, where the lateral wind load is taken by the masonry. So this is a step towards skeleton framing. It is not skeleton framing. As a footnote here, and this is a topic that some of you have heard me beat into the ground, we have the words backwards. I used cage framing to describe this particular type of building because it's a phrase that we don't use anymore. Both cage and skeleton framing were common terms in the 1890s. And I would argue we picked the wrong one to keep using today. Because if you think about it, a skeleton by itself, without any other tissue, is not a skeleton, it's a pile of bones sitting on the floor. Whereas a cage by itself has strength and stiffness. A cage by itself maintains its shape. So the thing that we call a skeleton frame, I would argue, in my opinion, should be called a cage frame. We got this backwards 120 years ago, and it's never going to change, so it doesn't matter what my opinion is. One last thing. Merchants Bank is, I think, 1898. Slenderness of 2.8, which is getting up there. The world building, yet again. 1890. And in case, let me see, can you see the cursor? That right there, the drum right below the dome, that's Joseph Pulitzer's office. So he had a nice view. He had a nice view of the Brooklyn Bridge, actually, from there. This is the same construction as the Merchants Bank, cast iron columns, steel floor beams, tile arch floors, in this case, a heavy masonry wall surrounding the frame. There's an argument to be made here about perception, and that is that we don't know what the future is going to bring, and neither did anybody in 1890. If it's 1890, and in 1890, and I'll be coming back to this topic in a second, in 1890, there were 2 skeleton frame buildings in the entire world as we are defining skeleton frame buildings in this talk. Nobody knows that that's going to be what we all end up doing. This particular design uses every material in a way that it's suited. It uses cast iron and compression, it uses steel and beams and bending, it uses mass masonry as shear walls. It's actually a fairly efficient design if that's your palette of materials. And in 1890, the big transfer of structural engineers from bridges to buildings had not happened yet. So there aren't very many structural engineers who are even giving thought to building a building like this, to designing a building like this. One last thing that's true about 1890 is that at that time, the worst failures of cast iron, and that is why we abandoned it as a structural material, is it kept failing spectacularly and bringing down entire buildings. Those were in the future. They hadn't happened yet in 1890. So I would argue that this building makes perfect sense at that time. It didn't make perfect sense 10 years later. That's how fast the technology was changing, and that is what happens with a rapidly developing technology. Think about the cell phone you have now versus the cell phone you had in 2000. Technology changes rapidly, and you have to either keep up with it or explain why you're not. Here are sections through the exterior walls of the world building at the lower floors. The blue is stone, the red is brick. You can just make out, you'll have to excuse me here. If you see those double dashed lines, that's the cast iron column embedded in the brick wall, and it comes down to basically a footing within the wall, sitting on the wall. So the main footings for the building are down here at the sub-basement level. The columns end a story and a half higher up. So this is very much a hybrid structure, right? This is not what we think of. You know, if you said to somebody, I've got a skeleton frame building, except the columns are sitting on the exterior wall a story and a half above the bottom of the foundation, they would look at you funny. And if you said, it's my opinion that that's a good building, which is what I said 2 minutes ago, they would look at you even funnier. The other type of cage frame building, this is the Havemeyer building in New York, unfortunately demolished. The floor loads are supported on the frame, the wall loads are supported on the wall, but the lateral wind load is supported by the frame. So this is a skeleton frame building, except that it doesn't support the walls. It's another step in the same direction. A frame-braced cage building. Here's the punchline. This is the same designer as the previous building, and it is literally 2 years later. This is George Post, and in 2 years he went from the wall-supported cage at World to the frame-braced cage at Havemeyer, and just a few more years down the road, he went to skeleton framing. Here is, and I don't expect any of you to read that, here is the framing plan for the Havemeyer building, and I do love the late 19th century habit of putting your elevators in a circle. I don't know why we abandoned that. It's great stuff, but here's a close-up on that plan, and you can make out, so those funny-looking squares with flanges, those are the columns. It's 2 channels and 2 plates, built-up column, really popular column in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Look at where the columns are in the exterior piers here. Again, the column is way to one side, way to the inboard face of the masonry pier, and there is no spandrel beam in the masonry pier. So there you can see it. This is still a cage frame building. Those masonry walls are self-supporting, but you have these steel columns as opposed to cast iron, and you can build a moment frame out of them, and that is exactly what Post did here. Five years later, 1897, this is the St. Paul building in New York, and this is Post yet again. And the wall section on the right shows you he has finally accepted skeleton framing. Now, when I say finally, again, skeleton framing was only 7 years old at this point. This is still very new technology, but he had accepted it. He's still running his columns inboard of the exterior wall, right? That's the wall. That's the column. But he's put spandrel beams on a bracket sticking out into the wall to support the wall. His explanation for this, by the way, was he was worried about corrosion. He was worried that the columns would corrode if they were embedded in the masonry, and therefore it was not a good idea to do that. And he felt that by doing it this way, if the beams corroded, they could be easily fixed. And there are at least 3 people in the room other than me who do facade repair on old buildings for a living. And I know that they all are agreeing with Mr. Post at this point. That has been a problem. So that's a skeleton frame building. Here are 2 skeleton frame buildings under construction. You know, it looks like one building, but it's not. In the background, the very tall, slender building is the Singer building under construction. This is 1907. The thing in front of it is the City Investing building, which is possibly the ugliest skyscraper ever built. And because it was literally 3 inches away from the Singer at some point, at some places, it's impossible to get a picture of the Singer building that doesn't include some of the City Investing building. They were both torn down for the U.S. Steel building, which you may or may not know. It's an SOM building. The reason you would know the U.S. Steel building is that under the new zoning laws in New York, when that was built, they had to create a plaza, and the plaza they created is where Occupy Wall Street was taking place. This is, by 1907, we've got fully developed skeleton framing going on here. The trademark of skeleton framing, the walls beginning in midair. It's what everybody noticed at that time. Because, you know, seeing steel being built up at the top, people didn't even know what it meant in that era. But seeing a masonry wall begin in midair was shocking. And that's what you can find one person after another talking about that. It's just this bizarre thing. There's a masonry wall. In this case, you can see that they've already built the lower floors of City Investing. The reason those 2 floors were missing is they had built the upper floors that were plain brick, and they were working their way up from the bottom with the heavily ornamented lower facades. If you insist on skeleton framing as part of your definition of skyscraper, Again, I don't approve. I'm not going to say you're wrong. If you insist on that, we have a tie. That is the Manhattan Building on the left here in Chicago, and that is the London and Lancashire Bank in New York on the right, unfortunately demolished. The Manhattan Building began in June of 1889. The London and Lancashire Building began a few months later in October of 1889. London and Lancashire, being a smaller building, was finished first in May of 1890, and Manhattan was finished in June of 1891. So I dare anybody to give me a rational explanation of which of those two buildings came first. It is a tie. And there's some interesting differences between the buildings. Obviously, the Manhattan Building is a much larger building. It also has a famous architect and engineer, that is Jenny. London and Lancashire was barely commented on at the time it was built. Now, again, this is 1890. So in New York, that's the 1887 building code, which required for a building of this size walls that were 30 inches thick. And obviously, this is a one-lot wide building. It's not as bad as the Manus building, but it's not much better. If you built those 30-inch walls, you would not have any meaningful space in the interior. The New York City Building Department and Building Code are really interesting in that era. The code is extraordinarily conservative. The Building Department was not. And if you went to the Building Department and said, we are providing a metal frame that can take the load, therefore we don't need those thick walls, they would give you a variance. I've seen those letters, and they are always, somebody must have been telling the architects and engineers what to say because the letters are nearly identical. I suspect it was a frustrated engineer working at the DOB, but I have no way of proving that. So the London and Lancashire building has walls that are 16 inches thick, top to bottom. It's the first building in New York where the walls don't get thicker as you come down the building. So it is interesting in that sense. It also has a not very good moment frame. I mean, it has a moment frame. I would not put my name on it if I were designing it today. The Manhattan building has a wind frame system, but not for its full height. So these are still experiments. These are still sort of groping towards the concept of a skeleton frame, but a tie. I absolutely love those three diagrams on the left. This is a fellow named William Fryer. And before I get to this slide, my William Fryer story. He was trained as an architect and engineer, worked for the New York City Department of Buildings, and then went into private practice, as far as I can tell, by himself. And he ran the same ad in the Real Estate Record and Guide, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a journal for people involved in real estate in New York. He ran the same ad for 20 years. It was a very small ad. And there was, the main body of the ad was some text about, I can help you understand the modern building code and modern fireproof building. In other words, I know the new technology. That's why you should hire me. His phone number in the earliest ad is 4 digits long, and by the last ad, 20 years later, it's 6 digits long. So technology was improving in a number of fields. But what catches your eye about the ad is the large text at the top of it, which says, charges high, services good. I wish I had the nerve to run an ad that said that. I admire this man more than I can describe for running that ad for 20 years. In any case, this was him in 1891. So there are 2 skeleton frame buildings in the country, and this is him describing how they came to be. And those 3 pictures on the left, he shows, there's actually a 4th picture which has just the masonry pier. He shows somebody putting a cast iron column next to the masonry pier, and then he shows the cast iron column embedded in the inside face of the masonry pier, and then he shows the column in the middle of the pier. And the exon on the right shows the column in the middle of the pier. That is very definitely a cast iron column. It's a hollow rectangular shape, and you can see the splice. All the details look like cast iron. But he's showing you how he actually talks about people began by reinforcing the masonry with iron, and then realized that the iron could carry all the loads. So this is an evolutionary process. This is the office building of the Jackson Iron Works facing Union Square in New York. The first 2 stories of the building still exist. The rest was demolished in the 1960s, and the 2 stories that exist have a glass curtain wall on them. So you would not think it's still there, but a piece of it still is. This is an example of what was going on in New York in the 1890s. This is 1892. This is a wall-braced cage, and I'm going to show you a floor plan in a minute. Has a slenderness of more than 6, which is very, very high for anything other than a skeleton frame building. It's actually, I mean, the old World Trade Center in New York had a slenderness of about 6.8. So it is a very slender building. But it's a wall-braced cage. And this is after skeleton frame buildings already had started to show up, because this is what people were comfortable with. This is what they were used to doing. There's a floor plan. Yeah, it does show up reasonably well. You can see this looks just like Fryer's diagram. There are the cast iron columns in the middle of masonry piers. Building is a block long front to back. It runs through the street from 17th Street to 18th Street, which is 200 feet. And there are no intermediate columns. This building has, by our standards, no definable lateral load system in the east-west direction. In the north-south direction, you've got those long side walls that serve as shear walls. In the east-west direction, you don't have anything other than the front and rear facades. You don't have a diaphragm that can get the wind load to the front and rear facades, and the front and rear facades are at the bottom, as you can see in this picture, mostly open space. Therefore, by modern standards, this building has no lateral load system and should blow over when the wind blows, which did not happen. And this building, by the way, meets the criteria for my research. It's 10 stories, it's more than 10 stories tall, and an occupiable building. The answer that I found was in an obituary. There's an engineer named Samuel Weisskopf, and as full disclosure, my first job was at Weisskopf and Pickworth, which is the firm he founded. Samuel Weisskopf began his career as an engineer working for Carnegie Steel, designing the frames of buildings. There didn't used to be structural consulting engineers for buildings, right? If people aren't building metal frame buildings, they don't need engineers to design them. So where did the engineers who do that come from? And the answer is, early on, the architect would draw a building that could only be built using cage framing or skeleton framing, and hand it to an iron contractor and said, you design the frame. And this was not just a New York phenomenon, this was national. There were engineers working for Carnegie Steel and the other big steel companies who would then design the frame and said, here's what you need. So that's how Weisskopf began his career, and eventually said, hey, I can go into business for myself. Founded as far as I can tell, the second consulting engineering firm for buildings in the US. The first was founded in Chicago by Corrigan Purdy. And both firms are now unfortunately defunct. I swear I did not kill Weisskopf. I was only there for 2.5 years. I did not destroy the firm. But in Weisskopf's obituary, 1930s, I think, I forget, it said that he was one of the first engineers to design wind-braced skyscrapers. Well, anytime you make a definitive statement, you have sort of by context defined something else as well. If he was one of the first to design wind-braced skyscrapers, then there must be non-wind-braced skyscrapers. And here it is. The Jackson Iron Works is an example of that. You knew I was going to get to this eventually, right? Home insurance on the left, tower building in New York on the right. So the home insurance building is 1885. And I'm fortunate that Tom Leslie gave me exactly the quote that I needed, which is from the engineer's report that was conducted during the demolition of the home insurance building. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the engineers who were examining the building explicitly say that, where is it? Okay, structural members were provided for supporting the masonry, implying a skeleton frame, but on account of the size of the piers, it is probable that the load was divided between the columns and the piers. The wind load was carried by the masonry as the steel work was not designed to take wind loading. The masonry work could not be started in an upper floor without providing temporary support for the 8 inches of masonry in front of the cast iron columns. In other words, this is a cage frame building. And don't blame me, it's a Chicago engineer who said this. Only his opinion, you feel free to disagree with him. The walls were not of the curtain wall were not of the curtain wall type, but were, as previously described, of the ordinary bearing type. I could keep going, but I think the gist of this is clear. So what the home insurance building is the first cage building of this era. You know, as people are developing this technology that I've been describing for the last 20 minutes, maybe a little longer, this is the first building where none of the floor load is taken by the walls, right? The stuff I just read, the walls are taking lateral load and they're taking their own weight. They are not carrying floor load. Now, I said earlier there were no sharp breaks. The year before this was built, in 1884, the Produce Exchange was built in New York. And in the Produce Exchange, roughly 5% of the interior floor area was carried on the exterior walls. Well, if you know anything about logic, the difference between, the opposite of all is not none, the opposite of all is some. The difference between 95% and 100% is a huge thing. But the point is that in terms of design, the buildings are very similar. Had the Produce Exchange, had the outermost row of beams been fastened to the columns rather than resting on the masonry piers, it would have been the first cage building and beaten home insurance by a year. It didn't, it wasn't. Home insurance is the first cage building. Does that make it the first skyscraper? Well, you know, you're going to argue that a cage frame building, which most people don't even know what that is the criterion. Good luck. I would not try to make that argument. Now, the tower building is 1889, and frankly was a grotesquerie. Another very narrow lot, and Gilbert's great idea was that, oh, by the way, 1889, and the first New York City Building Code to acknowledge that metal framing even exists is 1892. So he was in the gray area. And what he did was build a 6-story bearing wall building on top of a cage frame building. That's my definition of a grotesquerie. Kept the wall thicknesses down. He also had diagonal wind bracing connected to cast iron columns. Terrible idea. So both of these are interesting buildings in their own way. I'm not particularly compelled by either one. I like the title of that slide. 10 years earlier, 10 years before home insurance, this is the Western Union building in New York. Now, it's not even the tallest building in New York when it's built, because in 1874, the previous year, the Tribune building was built. And the Tribune building was 280 feet tall to the top of its tower, and Western Union was 230 feet tall to the top of its tower. If you want to take the main roof, we're looking at something like 190 feet. So it's quite a large building. You compare it to the buildings next door to it on Broadway, right? But here's why this is a very interesting building. This is 1875. And you see that the top 3 stories of the building are in a mansard roof. That mansard roof was skeleton framed. It's carried on trusses that run the full width of the building, and those trusses carry purlins and rafters, and that carries the sheathing of the mansard roof. So this is, in effect, a 3-story skeleton frame building on top of an 8-story bearing wall building. I shouldn't say nobody has ever claimed this is the first skyscraper. I think one of the articles in the JSAH from the 1950s does. It's not a popular choice for the first skyscraper. And I don't think it should be. I'm arguing, as if it's not really obvious already, I'm arguing there is no first skyscraper. But basically, this building has some firsts in it. And that can be said of many, many buildings. So here's my answer to the question I posed at the very beginning. What's the first skyscraper? Everything in these 2 pictures. That's Chicago at the top and New York at the bottom. They're not actually to the same scale. The tallest building you see in New York at the bottom is the Singer Tower, and it's significantly taller than the tallest building in the Chicago, but whatever. No, because Chicago had a height limit, and that limit was not imposed by design incapacity of Chicago architects and engineers or construction incapacity of Chicago contractors. It was imposed for social reasons, and therefore is sort of outside the scope of what I'm talking about. I've actually made the argument, and I'm going to make it here tonight in front of a bunch of people from Chicago, that the height limit probably meant that there were more buildings that meet my criteria than there would have been otherwise. Because if you can't build a 20-story building, you build two 10-story buildings. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right, I don't know. I know people who disagree with me about that. There is no single building that represents a significant technological break from what came before it. Those pictures that Fryer drew of the columns gradually moving out into the exterior wall, of people gradually moving their spandrel beams from inside the exterior wall into the wall, that is exactly what happens building by building. A little more load is being taken by the frame until 1890 when all of the load is being taken by the frame, but there's no break. And in terms of height, there's the issue of, why are you not counting the pyramids and the churches? But even if you're looking only at metal framed buildings, and something I can say that is there is an absolute first. The first concrete frame skyscraper, we know, it's the Ingalls building, because every concrete frame building before that is like 5 stories tall at the maximum, and Ingalls in 1903 in Cincinnati is suddenly 13 stories. So there's the first concrete frame skyscraper. That we can pin down. But I don't know anybody who's going to say that you need concrete framing for a skyscraper. All the early experiments were metal framing. Well, there is no way to use metal framing to draw a line and say everything before this is not a skyscraper and everything after this is. When I say there is no way, that's my opinion. I can't find a way to do it. And if you can, please tell me. I'm fascinated to hear it. If you can't do that, and if height alone leads you to things like the pyramids and the churches, then the answer is there is no first skyscraper. And that is my answer to this question. It doesn't mean that there is nothing to discuss. These are fascinating buildings, a lot of which are still with us. So we're working on them, we're using them, it's worth studying them. How did I get onto this rather bizarre path? I was reading, and this is embarrassing, in 1997, I was reading an architectural history, and I said, every time I read a history of skyscrapers, I see the same 24 buildings mentioned. And there's got to be more to the story than that, because there's no way that those 24 buildings, they weren't the only buildings built. And if they're the ones that are interesting, what makes them interesting compared to all the other buildings that were being built? And being who I am, being an engineer, and being somebody who I have much more faith in my ability to grind, to just keep doing something until I get to an answer, than to I don't have any faith in my ability to have a stroke of inspiration. But I can grind my way to an answer. And I said, the only way to get an answer to this is to look at all of them. So I set out as my research goal to find all of the buildings that met my definition of skyscraper up until 1900, because it seemed by then people had a pretty good idea what they were doing. By 1900, you've got buildings that look a lot like modern steel frame buildings. And 20 years and 440 buildings later, I had the answer, which I just gave you, which is there is no first skyscraper. Well, thank you for your attention. I believe we have some time for Q&A. Is that, yeah? So. Yes.
Do you think the soil conditions here have something to do with the evolution?
Okay, for everybody, I'm going to just repeat the questions back so everybody knows what they are. Do I think that the soil conditions in Chicago had anything to do with the evolution? There are a lot of external influences, and that is one of them. The thing is, there's a popular opinion that New York has great foundation conditions for tall buildings, and the answer is it does in some areas. It also has really terrible conditions in some areas, including areas where people wanted to build skyscrapers in the late 19th century. So actually, the first skyscraper in the U.S. resting on caisson foundations is in New York, because they had a lot, and it was just terrible soil, and they said, we're going to use pneumatic caissons. I think that people in Chicago were pushed towards lighter buildings by the soil conditions, and lighter buildings meant getting rid of the masonry walls, so it meant skeleton framing. But I also think people in Chicago had steel more at hand. There is no steel industry in New York, and there never has been. All the steel, the closest delivery of steel to New York would be Pittsburgh and Buffalo, which is a long way in the 19th century to be shipping steel for a building that's otherwise being built with local materials. Whereas there were cast iron foundries in New York. I think one of the reasons people in New York were reluctant to give up cast iron was it meant giving up local control over your structural material. And Chicago didn't have that problem because Chicago had steel works nearby. So, come on. You can't agree with everything I've said, yes. Okay, so I mentioned that cast iron facades were banned in New York. So cast iron was not banned, actually, ever. Technically, you could still use it today if you could convince someone at the building department. Exposed iron, non-fireproof iron was banned. And the reason it was banned was partly a delayed reaction to the Chicago fire. People's reactions to the Chicago fire were partially right on target and partially really irrational. And I've read descriptions of how cast iron failed terribly in the Chicago fire. And they show a photograph of cast iron that has failed, and right next door is a masonry wall that's failed in the same fire. And I'm not sure how you come to the conclusion that cast iron is the problem as opposed to a citywide fire being the problem. The other thing is there were fires in New York that destroyed exposed wrought and cast iron, building fires, not big-scale fires. And this was so it was a combination of a reaction to the Chicago fire and a reaction to the local building fires in New York. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about early development of lateral bracing and kind of the earliest examples that you saw of that?
Okay, so the question is about early examples of lateral wind bracing. Okay, let's put this in context. People had been building wind-braced frames in the U.S. for decades before the first examples in skyscrapers. They were called truss bridges. And if you look at the way people talked about early skyscrapers, you'll see things like, the wind bracing is a truss bridge set on end. You'll see phrases like that. And it's because people had come to trust truss bridges. They worked. They carried locomotives, the heaviest moving loads in the country. So that's sort of, as I said earlier, that's where the engineers came from. It took a while for people to understand that you needed wind bracing the same way in a building. And when I say a while, so up until the end of 1967, it was legal to build a building in New York without wind bracing as long as it was under 100 feet tall and had a slenderness of less than 4, which is a problem when you're doing something like working on an old firehouse and realizing that this building, which is supposed to be an emergency refuge, has no lateral load system. Not that I'm speaking from experience. So it really did take a while for people to understand that, and look, both New York and Chicago are exposed to serious wind loads, right? We get hurricanes, you get different types of storms. How do you brace the building? I mean, buildings had never been wind braced. They had been by masonry walls, but nobody said, I'm an engineer, I'm designing the wall. So the early versions of it were usually some kind of like a Warren truss type of wind bracing, but not necessarily the full height of the building, because it seemed like the wind problem didn't really exist at the bottom. So we only need wind bracing from the 5th floor up, which to a modern engineer is horrifying. Right? You're abandoning the wind bracing at the lower floors where it's the most important. As engineers moved into the field of building design, they started saying things like, what you're doing there is irrational. And after they were told to shut up a few times, they kept insisting, and eventually they got the message across. The early buildings tend to be a mix of moment frame and braced frame, same as we have today. I think people in general were more comfortable with the braced frames, and you see them more on the bigger buildings. but there are plenty of early examples of moment frames. Again, the people doing this mostly have bridge backgrounds, and stuff like Vierendeel trusses was not in common use yet. So diagonal bracing is the way people thought of bracing. The other difference, of course, is that when you're doing bracing in a bridge, you're only worried about load in one direction because gravity, fortunately, does not reverse. Whereas wind load is going to push in both directions, so you have to have wind bracing that's symmetrical for load in both directions. Certainly, it's less than 10 years to go from the early experiments to fully wind-braced frames, but there are still some awful buildings being built even in 1900 and shortly after. There was somebody, yeah.
What was inside the world building tower with the dome?
Yeah, above Pulitzer's office. The dome was, it was considered to be sort of secondary office space. I don't remember who, the world occupied a couple of the lower floors and the top of the building, and the middle of it was rental space. So one of the things that happens is companies are building these very tall buildings with space they don't need. And they're building them as money-making ventures. So, you know, the Singer Corporation is getting a lot of money in from its big building, even though Singer Corporation only occupies a few floors. The World Building is one of those. So the World Building occupied the cheaper space at the bottom, and they occupied, you know, the very top for prestige, and the middle of the building was rented out. I don't remember which World employees were up in the dome. I don't think they were necessarily, the windows were terrible up there. I don't think they were necessarily highly valued employees.
But Chicago didn't have that type of tower.
Well, that's later. So, okay, so the issue of towers, so until you have a skeleton frame building, having setbacks is really difficult. If you have a masonry wall that is carrying gravity load, it wants to go all the way down to the foundation. If you have a masonry wall that's carrying lateral load and you end it at a setback, you have to do a transfer. You have to have some kind of horizontal bracing to transfer the wind shear that's in that wall to other portions of the building. So building towers is really difficult until you get to skeleton frame buildings. And the way people did it was by having interior bearing walls in places. So I mentioned the Tribuna building in 1874 in New York is the 270 feet. It had a tower, and that was a pure bearing wall building, and the tower walls just continued all the way down to the foundation with, you know, doors in them. Because people in Chicago were trying to get away from those huge masonry walls, and again, I think that is in part because of the foundation conditions, they were less willing to do that. And after 1893, you weren't going to build taller than, I forget, it was 160 feet. So there was no point in having a tower. You wanted to have all your floors go all the way up, which is what leads to the cube buildings. Once Chicago starts to relax the height limit, then you start to see towers in Chicago, and that is after skeleton framing is established, so the towers are easier to build. Yes?
That was kind of surprising you didn't discuss the council on full buildings height criteria. Another subjective.
Yeah. Well, I had this conversation with some people there 3 years ago. The last time I was in Chicago, and one of the last trips I took pre-COVID, CTBUH actually, they have a mural in their office that begins with the home insurance building. And I asked them why, and I did not get a very satisfactory answer. This is why I don't get invited back to parties. I have no problem. I do not object to their height criteria. I don't think you would apply those height criteria to buildings from 1890. That doesn't make sense. I think they're fine for current day skyscrapers. I don't know that they're any better or any worse than anybody else's opinion on this topic. They actually think the push pin on top of the World Trade Center should be counted in the height, and I disagree with them on that. So.
Well, with that, folks.
Thanks so much. to Don for joining us. I'm Ann Sullivan. I'm a professor at the School of the Art Institute, but I'm here representing APT International. And Don's latest book has been published by APT International and is available for sale here, and Don will be signing copies, and you can ask him more questions. So please, you can stay, have a drink, talk with your colleagues, and buy a book. Thanks so much for coming tonight.
Thank you.
I was the only one who asked. I didn't. That was a surprise ending. I haven't read your book.
Excuse me, folks. Please feel free to stay and have another drink. The bar is open, and you are welcome to come and enjoy because the lights are beautiful once it actually gets dark. So stick around, have another one, mingle some more. You're all welcome. Thank you.